Hey guys, it's Danny from Virtuwolf, and today we're going to be giving you 4 programming tips to help with Unity. So, right now, I have in my Unity scene 4 scripts. I have a boss enemy, a small enemy, and a health script, as well as the enemy base script that we're going to be using. So if I open up this enemy script, this is the one that the boss enemy and the small enemy are going to inherit from. So when I want to create more different types of enemies in my game, this is what I'm going to be using as the base. But the problem is each enemy needs a couple of separate things. Each enemy would need to utilize some form of movement, and for this I would probably use a character controller. And the enemies would also need health. No matter what enemy they are, they would need health, and I would probably also link their movement to an animator. Now, depending on how many different types of enemies I create, this can be a bit of a time-consuming process because I would need to create each enemy prefab and attach those components to it. And let's say I took a couple of months away from making my game, and when I came back, I forgot exactly which components I need. Well, we can do this. We can actually solve this problem in the code. So if I open up my enemy class, and I was to put in between the using namespaces and the public class, if I was to put in the require components function, and I was to then say that I want the type of, and then this is where we'd put in which components these enemies actually need. So the first one that I'm going to need is an animator. And if I duplicate this a couple more times to make sure I include everything that I need in there, I would also need a character controller. I would also want an audio source so that they can actually react to things and speak to me and everything like that. And finally, I want to include a health script. This require component actually removes the need to drag these components on manually. So if I was to actually save this script, and let's say I go into my small enemy script, and I was to inherit from enemy. If I was to go back into Unity now that it's recompiled, I'm going to go over to this empty game object that has nothing in it. All it has is the transform. If I was to drag my small enemy script onto there, you'll see that it has added all of these components for me, just because it inherits from the original enemy script, which requires all these components. So it has the animator on there, the character controller, the audio source, and the health script as well. And if I was to try and remove one of these, like, I don't know if you'd accidentally remove a component, but let's just try it. So if I went to remove the character controller, it says that we can't remove that because the small enemy script depends on it. So you'd only be able to remove those once I remove the small enemy script, and then I can then remove the character controller. So I'm just going to undo that. The next tip is to do with what you might see on YouTube. So right now you can see in the inspector that my small enemy script, there's nothing to it. There's no fields in there, no attributes that can be changed or anything like that, because the small enemy script is empty and the enemy script is empty. But let's say that my enemy script, for all enemies, they need a walking speed. You might see a lot of YouTubers put in a public, let's say it's a public int called walking speed. And we'll set that to 10 for now. I'll save that and let it recompile. As you can see here, we now have this walking speed variable that has been serialized into the Unity editor, so we can actually edit it. And this is what I see a lot of YouTubers do in order to get a serialized field and also edit it in the inspector. But we don't really want to use a public a public variable, because that means that opens it up to accidentally being affected by other scripts. So whenever we are wanting to actually keep a private variable that allows it to be edited inside the Unity editor, we should be using the serialized field. That will keep it private, as well as allowing it to be edited in the inspector. And if I was to go back into Unity, we can see here that that walking speed is still available to us in the Unity editor, even though it is no longer public. And that's what we want. We don't want anything to affect our enemy's walking speed. That I know, I mean, you may have a spell or something like that, or some kind of ability that will affect the enemy's walking speed, in which case you would make it public, or you'd create a setter and getter function so that we can actually change those without accidentally changing the base variable. The next tip that I want to introduce you to is also, let's create a couple more of these. So let's say these enemies, they have a damage variable, a defense or armor, let's call it armor, and they also have a damage modifier, and we'll change the damage modifier to a float. I'll just keep them all at 10 for now, that's absolutely fine. But this walking speed and the damage, armor, and damage modifier, they are pretty much separate. So, I mean, in your code, you could put some empty space in there, just so that you know in the code they are separate. Well, another thing, if I was to save this and go into Unity, you can see here that they are not separated as such. We've got the walking speed, the damage, the armor, and the damage modifier. So we can add a header attribute to these. So, I mean, we couldn't, because there's only one walking speed variable, I mean, it's a bit redundant. However, we could probably add a header to it. And if I added a header, I can then say that this is to do with movement speeds, because I might want a running speed in there as well. And I can create a header for these variables, and I can call this battle stats or something like that. So if I was to save this now and go back into Unity, we can see here in the inspector that I now have headers for my variables to say, right, okay, these are to do with movement speeds, and these are to do with battle stats. And finally, one more tip that I want to share with you guys. So if we go back into the code now, if we go back into our enemy code, let's say we did need some public variables. So let's go down here, and I'm going to make a public boolean called isDead. I mean, we would actually have getters for things like these, but let's just say they're public for now. And then public, let's call it an integer, and I know we've already got a health script, but let's just, for the sake of argument, call this health. Because these are public, these will show up in the Unity editor. As you can see here, we've got an isDead and a health field in our inspector, but these are just variables that we will be modifying via another script, for example. So, but I don't want them taking up space in my inspector, because we do not want to change any values in them anyway. So what we would do is we would create another attribute, and we'd call this hide in inspector. And you know what, I'm going to copy and paste that under the health as well. Oh, sorry, over the health as well. And now, if we go back into Unity, we can see that even though these were public and they were serialized, they were public, so therefore they were serialized, because we just want to access them and we put the hide in inspector attribute in there, they are not being shown in the inspector, and we just have exactly what we need to actually modify the enemies without the public variables that we don't want to show up. So I really hope that those few quick tips helped anyone out there, and yeah, I'll see you next time.